Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We are going to get up close and personal with this really fascinating artist. If for some reason you've never been to one of these programs before, well, you have a lot of catching up to do because we've done, I don't know, 60 of them or so together. But actually, you don't need to do any sort of research or know anything in advance because I try to make these programs as accessible as possible to everyone. So welcome. My name is Jane O'Neill. I own the company Culturally Curious, and I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this. This is always like my favorite Thursday evening of the month because we have been doing this with these communities for so long, and we've got this nice little group that I feel like just really loves art and loves coming together on these Thursday evenings. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. We are going to turn our attention tonight to the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. He is the artist that brought dreams to canvas. He kind of revolutionized our visual world in that way. Who was painting dreams before Salvador Dali? He created some of the most recognizable and mysterious images in the history of art. Tonight, we are going to explore the man, the method, and the madness behind all of it, the melting clocks, and these mysterious dreamscapes. So let's get a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together tonight. We have about an hour of content, so relax, kick back. Here he is. We're going to see this familiar mustache throughout this hour. What a photo, right? We're going to get started with the man behind the mustache. Give a little bit of a peek at his early years, how he got started, and then turn our attention to the surrealist movement in general, just so you have a good grounding in terms of what that was and what it looked like, and then turn back to Salvador Dali, because this is a man who said he was painting his dreams. How do you do that? He said he was unlocking his unconscious. We'll take a look at what that looked like and how he did it. Now, despite that ability to access his unconscious, he very consciously quoted the masters in his artwork throughout his life. So we will look at his dreams of the masters, also fantasy and desire. His wife Gala was a frequent subject in his artwork for decades. We'll take a look at that. And then this last section here, the Master of Spectacle, is really about Dali as a performance artist. He was a larger than life character, and we'll see how images of him and some of his quotes sort of worked together to create this whole persona. He was a well branded individual. I mean, even just the mustache, it's like a little logo, isn't it? And then our conclusion is the persistence of Dali. That will be a nice, quick conclusion. Okay, so Salvador Dali painted about 1,500 paintings during his lifetime, created many more works beyond that, thousands. So tonight, in this 1 hour, we're going to be sort of skipping across the surface, seeing some of the most famous images, getting to know them and understand them a little bit better. And I think providing a good, broad, general overview in terms of who Dali was and what he was trying to do with his artwork. So let's dive in and get familiar with the man behind the mustache, okay? Just getting situated in terms of time and place. Place first, we've got our map of Spain. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to acknowledge the fact that we are looking at a Spanish artist tonight. His Spanish identity looms large, and beyond that, just the place of Spain looms large in his artwork. So Salvador Dali grew up in northeast Spain, up here near Figueres, and ultimately he would build like an extensive manor house right on the water there, on that shoreline. But the shoreline of Spain factors in a major way in his artwork. So I'm sure some of you have probably been to Figueres, Spain before, because that's where one of the Salvador Dali museums is. Now, when we're thinking about artwork at this time, a lot of art that was being created was being done in Paris, and we'll see that Salvador Dali spent some time there as well. But the Spanish identity, it's big. Now, if we're getting situated in terms of place, also time. Salvador Dali was born in 1904, and who doesn't love some good childhood pictures, right? We get a sense in terms of who this young man was from an early age. He was born into a rather prosperous middle class family. They weren't struggling in any way, and I think one of the most important things that happened to him while he was a little boy was was the fact that he was given the exact same name as his deceased older brother. So he had an older brother that he never met, a little boy who passed away around the age of 2 from an illness, and so after he passed away, 9 months later, this little boy was born, and his parents gave him the exact same name as his deceased older brother. When Salvador Dali was about 5 years old, his parents took him to the grave of his older brother that he never met. And they told him he was the reincarnation of his older brother. And apparently, that experience created a very slippery sense of self for Salvador Dali. He described himself as being kind of haunted by this notion of being someone else. Who was he really, right? So this concept of identity is going to loom large in his artwork. We'll be referring back to that along the way. I think you can see a little bit of the theatricality of this young man too in this lovely getup that we see over here on the left. Now, from a young age, he had an interest in art. It was supported especially by his mother, and we can see him here as a teenager sitting with a guitar, which, as far as I know, he never learned how to play, but he took a few good photos with guitars. We can see him sitting alongside a woman who is frequently cited as being his sister. I sometimes wonder if it's his mother, I'm not sure. But we can also see examples of his paintings as a teenager in the background. We can see the color version of the one that's on the far right over here in the image on the right. So we can see as a teenager, he's kind of internalized the lessons of Cubism, which would have been pretty much all the rage in Europe around this time. So um, he's working with a really reduced color palette here. He's flattening and fragmenting forms. He's done something rather impressive, especially for such a young person. And this is really where one of Dali's most remarkable talents lie, because as a young person, he became very well acquainted with different stylistic movements, and he could adopt them, appropriate them, copy them as needed. And this is something that we will see sort of carries through for him as well. We've got a painting by the Fauve artist Henri Matisse over on the left here. Bright colors, broad patches of paint. A familiar motif for Matisse was an interior with open windows or doors, revealing a view to the outdoors. And as a teenager, Salvador Dali adopts this bright color palette, really strong colors here, and he even creates a self-portrait in front of that familiar motif of Matisse's. So this is, a nice sort of appropriation. But when he tries on, let's say, Impressionism, we can see that he pretty much nails it. I mean, if you didn't look at the signatures here, you would be hard pressed to determine which one of these paintings was by Claude Monet and which one of these paintings was by Salvador Dali. I don't think most of us could make a good facsimile of a Claude Monet painting now, or especially when we were teenagers. So he has a really good eye, and he has a remarkable technical ability from a young age. So beyond, and I particularly love his ability to capture this sense of like the flickering light on the water, like the early hours of the day. So one last artist I want to show you, where Dali is sort of emulating the style here. And this is another Spanish artist, Pablo Picasso. So just the idea that one of the biggest players in the art world in the early 20th century is another Spaniard is something that would have really sort of galvanized young Salvador Dali. It's like, okay, I can be like Picasso, right? And in the early 1920s, Pablo Picasso was going through his so-called neoclassical period. This is an example of his work on the left, portrait of a mother and child. And then we can see Dali sort of trying his hand at something similar with his painting called Venus and the Sailor. And you can maybe make out the profile of that sailor who's kind of overlapping, but the Venus figure, but he's also kind of looking sort of flattened here. So he's got a little bit of the neoclassicism and a little bit of the early cubism there combined together in what I think is a really fantastic composition. So when Dali was still a very young man, he had the chance to go to Paris. And apparently, the first thing he did while he was there was track down Pablo Picasso, visited his studio, and said, I came here. Even before I went to the Louvre Museum, I had to come to the studio of Pablo Picasso. What a way to like ingratiate yourself to someone, right? And by all accounts, Pablo Picasso was very impressed with this young Spanish artist, and they kind of formed a friendship from there. Um, and and you know, it's not surprising that Picasso would have been really impressed with young Salvador Dali because the year after he painted Venus and the Sailor, he paints this still life that's simply called The Basket of Bread. Wow, right? I mean, we can feast our eyes on this one for quite some time. This is a young man, 22 years old, right? Who has like mastered realism here. There's just remarkable illusionism throughout this composition. And he finished this just a few weeks before he was set to graduate from art school. But at that time, he makes the outlandish claim that there was no professor at his art school who was qualified to grade him, essentially, that he had surpassed even all of his teachers. He gets expelled from art school just a few weeks before graduating, but this is a great way to launch yourself, right? I mean, he has a flair for the dramatic and for the theatrical. I do want to briefly introduce you to a character who had a big impact on Salvador Dali as a young man, especially when he was in art school. So we can see Dali in both of these photos with a young Spanish poet named Federico Garcia Lorca. And Lorca had an impact in the sense that he really opened up Dali's thinking about his very definition of the word, of the term art, and got Dali thinking much more creatively. I mean, we could say that Dali was very good at copying and had this technical ability. And it seems as though this relationship opened his mind beyond that, sort of helped to launch him. Now, the nature of this friendship is sort of uh, still contested, let's just say, by art historians. It does seem like it was maybe beyond friendship, but what we know is that it was intensely close, right? We're gonna I'm going to refer back to Lorca in just a little while, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this was a very important relationship in young Dali's life. And within the space of just a few years after this fiasco with art school, Salvador Dali is gracing the cover of Time magazine in the United States. So he becomes the very face of surrealism. It's not that his paintings are on the cover, it's him. And I think for many of us still today, he defines surrealism. We think of his artwork. So let's think a little bit about surrealism in general, and we'll learn a little bit more along the way in terms of how he becomes this international sensation. He can take a great dramatic photo. Let's just acknowledge that, right? But let's turn our attention to surrealism fully to understand what that movement was all about and what it looked like, okay? So we're going to start off with one of the leaders of the movement. This is another great photo of a young man named Andre Breton, a Frenchman. And the surrealist movement was an international movement that really started in Europe, and it started as a reaction against World War One. Think of World War One, and it was a horrific, terrifying experience for the people that lived through it. And the end result was a lot of young people that sort of felt like the world didn't make sense anymore. And this idea that rational thinking, logical thinking is what got the world into that mess in the first place. So these young surrealists are thinking about and fascinated by the idea of accessing something else in our brains. the unconscious, essentially. What's happening there that we're not even aware of or in control of, per se. And if you could marry that with reality, then you could create sort of a super reality or surreality. So Andre Breton here writes the first of several surrealist manifestos. A manifesto makes it sound pretty political, right? And it was. I mean, this was like an anti-bourgeois movement. It was it was people who were talking about changing the way they lived, changing the world to better accommodate this new approach to art making. So I want to give you two examples of surrealist painting. These are not by Salvador Dali, but it gives us a little bit of visual variety for tonight. On the left, we have a painting that's actually called The Triumph of Surrealism. The painter is Max Ernst. We'll see a little bit more of him along the way, and just try to make sense out of the triumph of surrealism as I'm talking. I mean, we can see sort of multiple figures in this one being. And then over here on the right, we have a work by a female artist whose name is Rita Kern Larson, and this is her self-portrait. You can see the face that's turned away, but then we have elements of the face, facial features here, the eye and the nose and the lips, sort of disembodied and floating in space in other parts of the picture plane. So when we think of surrealism, what does it mean? Like, how do we define it? First and foremost, there's a surrealist artists prioritized automatism, which meant that they wanted to access the unconscious brain. And they felt that they could do that simply by picking up a pen or a pencil and just letting their hand go without any intentional movement on a piece of paper. So really this sense of releasing conscious control was a big part of it. Beyond that, you have surrealists who are interested in showing you unexpected juxtapositions, coincidences, sort of the marvelous in this world. And you have this notion too that they're fascinated by dreams and the unconscious. You look at these images, and they don't look like things that are based in our world. There are references, of course, to things that look familiar, but these are illogical images by and large, right? So surrealism is in many ways about liberation. It's a liberation for artists who are no longer tethered to creating something that looks like it's of this world. It's a surrealism, right? It's beyond the reality that we exist in. All right, so that's a lot of words. How do you really define surrealism? We're going to look to Salvador Dali's definition of surrealism. And he had a pretty quick and easy definition that that also speaks to his exaggerated confidence. And that is, what is surrealism? Surrealism is myself. And of course, this is the way most of the world still thinks of surrealism. It's Salvador Dali. Now, this interest in the unconscious and dreams was very much tied to Sigmund Freud. There was a fascination with the unconscious because of Freud's writings. And Salvador Dali actually got to meet Sigmund Freud. What would it have been like to have been a fly on the wall for that meeting? Well, at the very least, we get a little sketch of Sigmund Freud by Salvador Dali. How exciting is that? By all accounts, Freud was kind of delighted by young Dali as well, sort of like the same way that Pablo Picasso was, although he did refer to him as having fanatical eyes after that meeting. So surrealism could look like this. This is a great example of like an automatic drawing. And you could be doing this right now as you're listening to my voice. Just pick up a pen and just start letting it move around the page. And for an artist like Andre Masson, who created this work that's in the Museum of Modern Art, you can see that with some of the automatic drawing sort of starts to refer to body parts, right? There's like a hand over here, maybe you see another hand over here. So there's this sense that that automatic drawing might sort of access the unconscious, and you can kind of follow it and pursue it as you're doing this. It's unlocking something for you. A friend of mine said to me the other day as I was telling her about this, like, well, what happens if you're just kind of making spirals and nothing comes out of it? And I kind of joked, but I think that this is true. that with automatic drawing, it's sort of like a Ouija board, and you've got the little viewfinder. And if nothing interesting is happening, you push it and you make it happen, right? So that's automatic drawing. That's one way to access the unconscious. Another way that surrealist artists were really sort of liberated by in their artistic practice. Another way they did this was this process that's called the exquisite corpse, which is essentially like a parlor game. It's a collaborative effort where you take a piece of paper and you fold it like you're folding a letter. And so you'd pass this piece of paper around, and one person would do the top part of this fold, and then just continue their line slightly over the edge, fold the piece of paper so that the next person to see their drawing only sees those two little lines, and then they know to make a torso from that, and so on and so on. So you just hide what you did, you extend your little lines over the edge of the fold, and then you collaboratively make a human figure, an exquisite corpse this way. And you can do this with poetry too. Maybe you should do this at your next dinner party, right? And hopefully the images aren't quite so disturbing. But when you see these all together, it's another sort of sense of liberation, right? It's a new way to create something. These are really novel sort of constructions that allowed surrealist artists to think differently. Another major idea related to surrealism is the concept of biomorphism. This is a painting by Juan Miro, another Spanish artist who was known for his surrealist work that has a lot of these little elements in it that sort of look like they're alive. Maybe they're like part of a cell. Maybe it sort of looks like sperm or eggs or what have you, but these little references to something squiggly that looks like it could move around and have a little life of its own. These biomorphisms are a huge part of the surrealist movement, and we'll see that Salvador Dali uses a few of them too. Now I'm going to use this little lit pipe over here as a segue to our next slide, another famous surrealist image, this one by the artist Rene Magritte, and it's called The Treachery of Images. This is from 1929. So what we're looking at is a very crystal clear presentation of a pipe with the text down below that says, "This is not a pipe." So what does that mean? Right? I mean, the most simple terms, of course, it's not a pipe. It is a painting of a pipe. That is the treachery of images, right? We think that we're looking at something that's real, but it's not that. It's a representation of that. So this idea of your eye fooling your brain, brain fooling your eye, is a concept that certainly Salvador Dali is going to explore as well. Now, I mentioned juxtapositions before, and that is something that Salvador Dali liked to explore, particularly in his sculptures. An example of his sculpture is on the right here, the lobster phone. We have the Fur Teacup by Merritt Oppenheim on the left. Both of these pictures, I think, or both of these sculptures, I think, give you, the viewer, a really visceral reaction. Who among us would like to drink our tea out of that little fur teacup or stir it with that fur spoon? How would it feel to hold a lobster against your ear? Ooh, there's a big ick factor for me in that. And for Salvador Dali, the fame of this particular sculpture is something that carried through for most of his life. He becomes closely associated with lobsters. It becomes this famous symbol that he includes with a lot of his artwork. To him, lobsters represented, like, it was like a sexual symbol. It was erotic. He associated it with uh, feminine sexuality in many ways. This idea of like there's a hard shell, like women are hard to understand, but then there's like a soft center there, which is so sensual. So we can see he's photographed with lobsters, and I should say that Salvador Dali never misses an opportunity to be photographed with something silly on his head. There's a lot of photos out there like that, but he uses that symbol throughout his career. And he actually collaborated with a fashion designer back in the 1930s, I believe, to make this lobster print evening gown. And notice where he places this lobster in on the dress. It's like over the female genitalia. So his sexual symbolism becomes wearable art. And just a few years back, the then editor of Vogue magazine, Anna Wintour, is wearing an updated version of Salvador Dali's lobster dress here. Notice that the lobster's been sort of moved to the side at this point, but Dali, his ideas, his innovations, and his contributions to various fields, lasting impact. Now, let's talk a little bit about Salvador Dali and his relationship with the surrealists, okay? Because he doesn't, he actually gets kicked out of the surrealists. And I think most people forget about this because he's the face of surrealism. Well, these two guys over here on the right are part of the reason for that. We are, of course, looking at a photograph of Adolf Hitler and the fascist leader of Spain, Francisco Franco. Salvador Dali, according to the other surrealists, talked about Hitler, was sort of fascinated about Hitler, talked about Hitler in in sort of ambiguous terms a lot during his life. And he made some ambiguous art about Hitler. He didn't just outright condemn Hitler as most people did. And that made people ill at ease with his politics. Beyond that, he chose to return to Spain after the Spanish Civil War when Francisco Franco was in power, despite the fact that Francisco Franco's own troops assassinated Dali's good friend, Federico Garcia Lorca. His friend was assassinated by this political regime, and Dali was sort of like, oh, I'm okay with them, and later becomes sort of chummy with him. So for his politics, he was expelled from the Surrealist group, but there was one other factor that contributed to this expulsion too. And it was the fact that Dali's work sold really well, and he was considered a sort of sellout during his lifetime. He was just too successful. And here he is, kind of in photos that are playing to that fact, right? He's got the money, the $10,000 bills pierced by his mustache over here. Over here, his mustache is making the dollar sign. He's surrounded by these coins. And we can see this name here, Avita Dollars. It's an anagram of Salvador Dali. It's created by Andre Breton, the leader of this surrealist movement. And it essentially means like avid for dollars, like eager for money. You're a sellout. So he gets kicked out in the end. But you could make the case that it was because he was just too darn successful. So let's take a look at the art that made him so successful. Let's think about unlocking the unconscious. We're going to start with that most famous painting, the image that was on their title slide. This is Dali's most famous work, The Persistence of Memory from 1931. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. All you have to say is melting clocks, and everybody on the planet knows what you're talking about, even if they don't know the artist or the title of the work. I like this image here because you can see just how small the painting is. What an outsized impact for such a little work, right? When it was being exhibited among other works of surrealist art for the first year after its completion, this was the work that everybody focused on. If there was a review of an exhibition, they always pictured this work. And one reviewer, one critic, referred to it as like a 10 by 14 stick of Dali dynamite. This is a work that has this remarkable staying power for so many reasons. Let's start off with the primary reason, that is Salvador Dali himself. I mean, he was a very young man, sort of charismatic when he made it, and he had a really compelling story around this painting and others like it. We're looking at a painting that he created that has this crystal clear quality to it. It's like a dream, but it's defying logic, and it has these distortions and unexplainable elements to it. And Salvador Dali claimed that he could induce a sort of liminal state between wake and sleep. He called it his paranoid critical method. And in that state, he could paint his dreams. In fact, he called his paintings hand painted dream photographs. Now, that's a great story. That's a great story, right? And who doesn't want to see what a hand painted dream photograph could look like? And and he delivers. I mean, there's just something about these images that that there's enough of reality and references to the world that we live in that anchor them, and then enough that's inexplicable about them that keeps you wondering and looking and guessing. So let's just kind of work our way through this picture for a moment. This is a picture. I kind of always start over here on the left, and I notice that there are these two rectilinear platforms, one sort of shallow and one seems kind of tall, and they're out here in the outdoors. This is a seascape, and there are these cliffs or hills in the background. You can just make out the horizon line in the distance. There's some blue sky at the top. These cliffs or hills are a reference to the Spanish shoreline. So it's sort of like where Dali grew up, kind of. So I that part of this I think really resonates with me. I don't know how often you do this, but like sometimes I dream and I can see crystal clear visions of like where I spent my childhood. So this notion of like connecting back to landscapes that are familiar seems really true to like a dream experience. Now, getting back to these platforms, we can see that there is this tree trunk inexplicably growing out of this rectilinear platform. It looks like a dead tree trunk. It looks like it's hollow, and it has just one long branch that stretches out towards the center of the composition. And hanging over that branch, like a wet towel, is a melting clock, is a wilted clock. We can see another one of them bent over backwards in this blob at the center of the composition, and a third one that seems to be melting, almost like wilting down the side of this rectilinear sort of stage. One fourth clock is here that we don't see the face of that clock. It's like a little pocket watch that's face down. And I can zoom in on this. We can see that there's like a cluster of ants gathering on the back of that watch, almost as though there's like something decaying there, something that had been alive and now is attracting insects in a sort of a negative, sort of grotesque way here. Somebody asked Dali if, well, let's talk a little bit about melting clocks. What does that mean? What does that symbolize to you? I love that we're doing this in November. We've all just been through daylight savings time, and we all know that the feeling of like shifting time can be so disorienting, right? And we all know that sometimes we dream and it feels like you've had a 10-hour dream and you've only been asleep for 30 minutes, or the opposite. You've been asleep for 8 hours and your dream is just this one very intense moment. And so in some ways, this painting seems to be about our malleable sense of time while we're sleeping. Okay. In addition to that, Dali was asked if this painting was at all a reference to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. And to that, Dali responded that the inspiration for the painting was the remains of a very strong camembert cheese. So supposedly he saw some cheese out in the sun and it just sort of started melting, and that was his inspiration. You can take that for what it's worth. Now, there is a little joke embedded in the painting too. We can see for this clock right over here, we're going to zero in on it. There is a fly on the top of that clock. We saw the ants before, but this is a fly. Some art historians say this fly has a human shadow. I don't quite see that, but just having a fly on the surface of a timepiece is sort of the pun, like time flies, chicken, that's there. So one last important element for us to recognize and try to understand is that big blob, that biomorphism, right? That's right here at the center of this composition. What is this all about? It is generally understood to be an abstracted self-portrait of the artist, that this would be his nose, this would be his eyebrows, this would be his eyelashes. Maybe this is a tongue sticking out. I don't know. It sort of looks like a rock underneath him. It's hard to say. We don't see that mustache that he's so well known for. Oh, maybe this is the tongue over here. Some people think that these cliffs over here, right on the Spanish shoreline, some of them have very distinctive rock outcroppings that have been carved by wind. over many, many years. Some people think that the shape of this biomorphism was inspired by those Spanish rocks. Another theory has to do with a reference to art history and a reference to this specific work by the artist Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch lived around the year 1500, so 400 years before Salvador Dali, but he was considered sort of like the godfather, or at least the grandfather, to the surrealist movement. Hieronymus Bosch made absolutely crazy, fantastical art during the Renaissance, and he was living in the northern part of Europe at the time. So we can see strange juxtapositions in his paintings, like the ears over here with the blade coming out. I want to draw your attention to the left-hand panel in his most famous work here, which is called The Garden of Earthly Delights. That left-hand panel is understood to be an image of the Garden of Eden. This is supposed to be God who's creating Adam and Eve. You can see all sorts of animals. There's a unicorn here, there's an elephant, a giraffe. But in the middle ground here, there's a pool of water with some birds on the surface, and then all of these creatures crawling out to the shoreline. And it's this sort of profile that's created on that shoreline that kind of looks like that abstracted profile that we saw, that biomorphism on the ground in the persistence of memory. Did Salvador Dali really study this work so carefully that he decided to appropriate a little landmass as himself in his painting? I don't know. There's a little mustache there. You be the judge. I think it's pretty compelling. So he could have very well been quoting this early master work, and it would make sense because Bosch was so important to the surrealists. Now, these melting clocks, these famous melting clocks, served Dali so well. His entire life, the rest of his career, which extended well into the 1980s, he was producing melting clocks in a variety of forms, in sculpture, in tapestry, like we see here at the center, in the playing cards that we see on the right. And these works always sold. I mean, who among us would turn down some melting clocks by Salvador Dali? It's like owning a little piece of history, right? Let's for our purposes, let's take a look at a few other paintings that he created using this paranoid critical method that he used, where he could induce this kind of liminal sleep state and paint his dreams. This is a work from about 3 years later. It has a really interesting title. It's called The Weaning of Furniture Dash Nutrition. We could spend a long time trying to decode that, but let's try to make sense out of what we're looking at here. We have the familiar Spanish shoreline, lots of very realistic elements to it with the boats and the buildings. And then closest to us in the foreground, we see a woman from behind. It seems as though there's some sort of covering over her face and over her lap. And we can see that her like a big rectilinear piece of her torso is missing. And it seems to correspond to the shape of this nightstand. And there's a space, there's a void in that nightstand, which corresponds to a smaller nightstand with the bottle on it. So it's like the weaning of furniture is like taking these pieces of furniture away. That void is left in her body. She has no spine. And so she's still sitting there on the shoreline as though she's still alive. And Dali has propped her up with this spindly little crutch. Apparently, he was fascinated by crutches. He went into his family's attic as a child, saw a crutch that I think had belonged to his father, and just was like mesmerized. And so crutches loom large in his body of work. Sometimes they refer to like frailty and decaying structure. Sometimes they refer to ego, but they're there. They're there a lot of the time. So let me show you another paranoid critical method painting. This one's from 1937, and it's called Swans Reflecting Elephants. It's a great painting. This is a very complicated painting. So we see the three swans resting on the surface of the water, and their reflections turn into the heads of elephants, and those long swan necks become the trunks of those elephants' faces, and then the trees in the distance become the legs of those elephants. There's other fantastical elements here, some sort of interesting shapes in the clouds. There's like a vague moon there, some fires, what's probably a self-portrait of the artist over here, a fascinating biomorphism in the foreground. But let me just say that this is an optical illusion. This is a little bit like M.C. Escher, who we looked at a couple of months ago. This is a complicated picture, and it doesn't just, I mean, I would be very surprised if it just spontaneously happened. It's okay to be skeptical as to the claimed method that he used in order to create this. I would imagine something like this required a lot of planning. The art world was skeptical about his method. His so-called method, was a really good promotional tool. But this is an optical illusion that sort of lines up with well, this is not a pipe, right? The treachery of images. Like, you can look and your reality is one thing, and then you can see something else, and your eye can fool your mind can fool your eye. All right, one last painting from this period that I wanted to share with you. And really, Dali kind of stops this paranoid critical method by the end of World War II. This is a painting that he did in the middle of the war, 1943. He was in the United States when he painted it, and it's called The Geopoliticus Child Watching the Birth of the New Man. Wow. So there's some politics here. There's some familiar Dali symbolism because Dali loved eggs, and the symbol of eggs was an important symbol to him. But in this case, he's kind of turned the planet, the globe, into an egg, and it's an egg that's kind of stretchy. And we can see this male figure, it's presumed male figure, breaking out of this egg. It still has a crack with one giant droplet of red blood. And this figure is actually emerging from this egg. So it's sort of like a new birth. And he's emerging over the shape of the United States, and he's bracing himself on Europe here. So he's coming up and he's pushing Europe down, or at least stabilizing himself with Europe here. So you can read a lot about the politics of the day into a work like this one. Now, there's all sorts of surrealist elements to this painting. There's, like, again, this kind of familiar dreamscape that's sort of inspired by Dali's time and experiences in Spain. We have these kind of grotesque elements that go along with the picture that also kind of fascinate you. The fact that, you know, the countries almost seem to be like weeping and dripping in the same way that that big droplet of blood is. So, so he's inviting, I think, different kinds of interpretations and a general fascination with his strange combination of elements here. But I mentioned he loves an egg, and he loves a good photograph. So here he is sort of posing with an egg. And this is quite a photograph over here on the right, because he is, well, he builds this great estate for himself right on the Spanish shoreline after all these years of success. And he sort of punctuates the roofline of that estate with all of these gigantic eggs. So he was a showman through and through. Now, this fascination with dreams and unlocking the unconscious means that Salvador Dali sort of enters into our visual vocabulary as human beings on this planet, a way to a way to express what our dreams are like, that isn't just like the mindless meandering of somebody explaining their dream. So Dali actually collaborated with Alfred Hitchcock to create a dream sequence in one of his movies. This is the 1945 movie Spellbound here. You can watch that whole dream sequence on YouTube if you're interested in. It does get a little bit gross at certain points, but obviously we see the giant eyes here. So one last painting from this section. This is Salvador Dali's sort of nightmare of a self-portrait. It's called soft self-portrait, or self-portrait with bacon. That's what this thing is here. And what we're looking at is Salvador Dali's face sort of becoming a biomorphism here. It's this gelatinous blob. It's this form that can't even support itself. So there's all these crutches propping up the face in interesting ways. This kind of goes back to that notion of the young man who learned he was, or was taught he was, the reincarnation of his dead brother, his own sense of self was fragile, was slippery, and we can see that manifesting in this really unusual self-portrait. We also see that fascination with with the crutches too, which again sort of go back to this sense of fragility, sometimes referencing ego as well. Here's a great photo of the artist with his self-portrait. So let's turn our attention now to something that is much more consciously done in Salvador Dali's body of work. This is a section called Dreams of the Masters, because Salvador Dali was always interested in what other artists were doing or had done. And so his entire body of work, his artistic output is like engaged in a conversation with the art that was being made at the same time and the art that came before him. This is a self-portrait that he created when he was just a teenager that was called Self-Portrait with a Raphael-esque Neck. That is quite a neck, isn't it? It's like a giraffe neck here, and he's sort of twisting it and looking over his shoulder at us with these great sideburns here. So what does that mean, a Raphael-esque neck? Well, he is referring to the Renaissance master Raphael, who we can see here in a self-portrait, a sort of similar pose where he's looking, twisting his neck and looking over at us. Raphael kind of specialized in these portraits of sort of sensual young men, like this guy down here named Bindo Altaviti, who are posed with their little sideburns too, with their long, gracious necks kind of twisted to turn over their shoulder. And so young Salvador Dali was thinking, I'm going to create something sort of similar to that. And it wasn't just about Raphael. He was interested in all the Italian Renaissance artists. Here is his specific reference to Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Everything comes back to the Mona Lisa, right? So instead of Mona Lisa's subtle little smile with that very subtle shading that Da Vinci used, here we have Dali's mustache kind of taking over the face, and his eyes, of course, as well, his hands as well, too, with the coins kind of spilling out. But you have to be a real art insider to know that there's like a double reference here, because before Dali made this photograph, there was another artist that came along in the 20th century, Marcel Duchamp, who took a little reproduction of the Mona Lisa and graffitied it, gave her a little mustache and a goatee, and then added these letters that when you sound them out in French, it's like a little naughty joke. And this became a work of art on its own. So Dali's send up in this photograph here is a reference to both the Mona Lisa and Marcel Duchamp. And of course, anything with a little mustache, he's got to take to the next level. Now, in addition to the Renaissance, Salvador Dali also loved the Baroque. And the painting The Lace Maker by the artist Johannes Vermeer was a painting that fascinated him. This is another image that that he saw as a child that captivated him. Apparently, his father had a reproduction of this painting in his office, and like 9-year-old Salvador Dali couldn't take his eyes off of it. So the original work is the one over here on the left. It's Vermeer's smallest painting. It does have this kind of abstract element to it with the thread coming out towards us, kind of pooling down the edge of the surface here. And Dali said he could create an exact copy of this work in just 1 hour. In fact, he got special permission from the Louvre Museum that owns the painting to sit with it in private for 1 hour. And this is, in fact, Salvador Dali's painting over here on the right. It's not what he produced in that hour with the original lace maker. Instead, he produced something closer to this. This is sort of an exploded rhinoceros horn view of the lace maker. There's a lot going on here, but I'll just try to summarize it quickly. in the beginning in the 1950s, in the atomic age, Salvador Dali becomes sort of obsessed with like exploded views of things. He also becomes obsessed with the form of the rhinoceros horn. He believed that the rhinoceros horn's spiral shape was nature's most perfect form. So he loved to break down a picture according to its essential elements and according to the shape of a rhinoceros horn. So that's what he's done here with the lace maker, but he doesn't stop there. He actually went to a Paris zoo and staged this little performance right alongside the rhinoceros at the zoo. He hung up a little fabric reproduction of the lace maker, and then he's sitting here making another rhinoceros horn exploded view of the lace maker, all while holding a piece of bread on his head while he's painting in a wheelbarrow. I mean, this is real performance art, right? And at the end of this performance, he tried to get the rhinoceros to gore the image of the lace maker. The rhinoceros was not interested in doing that. So Salvador Dali apparently like took like a spear and gored this reproduction of the painting as part of the performance too. So quite the showman, right? In addition to the lace maker, Dali was just kind of fascinated with Vermeer himself. This figure here has always been thought to be a self-portrait of Vermeer in one of his most ambitious paintings called The Allegory of Painting. So we see him from behind here. He's wearing this kind of slashed shirt. And Dali appropriated that image and uses that reference to Vermeer in so many of his works. And like these mysterious dreamscapes, he almost always makes Vermeer this very tall, skinny figure that is often on one knee with an extra long thigh bone that sort of becomes a tabletop. And then oftentimes we see the crutch underneath the arm as well. So this strange distortion in the figure of Vermeer. In addition to the Dutch Baroque, Dali also loved the Spanish Baroque. No big surprise there because his Spanish identity loomed very large. And this image here is like a masterwork of the Spanish Baroque. It's a painting by the artist Diego Velázquez, and it's called Las Meninas, or Maids of Honor, or Maids in Waiting. And it's an image of the Spanish royal family. It's like 10 feet tall. And Dali would have been familiar with it because it's at the Prado Museum in Madrid. And what we see here is the Princess of Spain, the Infanta, front and center, looking directly out at us, engaging us. And just over her shoulder, we can see something that sort of stands out from the other artwork in the room because it almost seems to have this white or brightness to it. So art historians understand that as being a mirror. And in that mirror, we can see the reflection of two people that would be the king and queen of Spain. So here is Diego Velázquez standing as the artist creating this work in front of a giant canvas. And it's a self-aggrandizing self-portrait. I mean, he is more important and more impressive, really, than the king and queen of his country here. So no wonder Salvador Dali loved it, right? So this is a 10-foot tall painting. Dali went to the Prado and he made his own little sketch. This is only 7 inches tall, but we can see that he's like fascinated by like the lines of light and shadow. He's kind of got the whole composition together here. And then he makes a strange adaptation. And I should mention, he re-engages with this artwork probably dozens of times throughout his career. But in this case, he's turned all of these figures into mathematical figures, into numbers. And it is just like these lines of light and dark. The Infanta is this curvy little 8 here with all of the bright white on her. The figure of the artist becomes a 7 with a paintbrush. The canvas itself becomes its own figure too. I love that the dog lounging in the foreground becomes the number 2 here as well. So some art historians are like, oh, Dali was so fascinated with mathematics and numbers. But when I looked at this, the first thing that popped into my mind was that maybe Dali saw some sort of interpretation of this painting where the figures were numbered, and that was like a key to some text of like an explainer for the painting to understand who each one of these characters are. You can find an image like this even on like the Wikipedia page for the painting. And so it's as though he took those numbers and he made the characters entirely those numbers. Now, in addition to this, and like I said, there's so many more reinterpretations of this painting. I've got one last one for you. And this work is from 1977, and it's simply called Las Meninas. We can see that he's made a painting here of a painting. This is the edge of a canvas, but it's part of the painting. And Las Meninas is floating in the sky. And it's a nice little likeness of the original artwork, but half of the figures are missing. And he's even painted the paintbrush illusionistically, like a little trompe l'oeil element, as though the work is being created in real time. There is a figure in the foreground, a woman that we see from behind who's blocking out the sun. So we don't really know if it's like sunrise, sunset, but it has this glowing ethereal quality to it. This figure, who we see from behind, is our segue to our final image from this section. And that was the figure of Gala Dali. And we can see her here in a very realistic portrait that was inspired by another work from a Renaissance master. We're going back to Raphael now. This is Raphael over here on the left, Raphael's painting of his mistress. And we can see that Dali is very consciously quoting that famous work by having his beloved sit before him with her breast sort of similarly exposed and her arms kind of cradling herself this way. So Gala has a huge impact on Dali. Let's talk a little bit about Gala the Muse. We can see her over here in a photo on the left, and on the right, we have a group photo of surrealist artists and poets. Gala had been married to this surrealist poet that we see over here. Here's Andre Breton next to him. Here's Salvador Dali next to him. Over here is Max Ernst, whose work we saw sort of at the beginning of the hour. Gala had been married to this guy. She'd had an affair with this guy, and then she met this guy, and everything changed. Gala and Salvador just immediately connected. It's safe to say they became sort of obsessed with each other when they met. And Gala was still very much married to another man, but to be with Salvador Dali, she sort of leaves her marriage and actually abandons her 11-year-old daughter. And this relationship becomes all consuming for both of them. Dali's family was so disapproving that they actually estranged themselves from him. And his life and her life become all about being together. Gala, in fact, becomes a fantastic and remarkably successful manager of his career. She's so good at it that other artists would go to her and say, can you manage my career too? She becomes the inspiration for his artwork and sometimes even the canvas for his artwork, as we can see here. So she's business manager, wife, muse. She eventually gets divorced and marries Dali. And they remain together essentially for the rest of their lives, but it is an open marriage. And Gala is really the one that has that the majority of the freedom in that open marriage. Dali is fascinated by her, paints her throughout his life. Here we can see Gala with the familiar symbol of the lobster on her head. We know that's an image of female sexuality, right? I can't explain the plane flying off of her nose over here, but we do see Gala sort of smiling with what looks like a piece of meat. I believe it's supposed to be a pork chop on her shoulder, sort of like that self-portrait that he did with the bacon before. And one of the things that I do really appreciate about his paintings of Gala, they've been called some of the most affectionate and celebratory images of a middle-aged woman that exist in the history of art. So Dali has that going for him. Now and I should say, he even starts signing his paintings with both of their names. That's a credit to him as well. He actually said, all of my pictures are drawn in Gala's blood. So there's an intensity to this connection here. And certainly there's there's the sexual nature of their relationship and the unusual dynamics of that relationship as well. I won't go too into that just in case, we've got general audiences here tonight, but we can see in the series of pictures, which spans, I think, a decade or more, sort of a strange approach to intimacy. It seems as though Salvador Dali was oftentimes much more comfortable painting Gala from behind. Like the intensity of this connection, had she been facing him, might have been too much for him. So we can see her slowly over time kind of disrobing and this lovely back of hers that he paints. But it seems as though that's all he's ready and willing to paint in some ways. Some of you might remember from the selfie program back over the summer, a great self-portrait by Salvador Dali, which probably makes a lot more sense now in context, where we can see him painting himself from behind, sort of like the Vermeer or the famous Rockwell painting. But then Gala, he's painting from behind too. It's a strange setup for any sort of portrait or self-portrait, though we can see their faces in the mirror here. So he continues on in this vein for much of his career. That's not to say he never painted her facing forward. Around the time he was interested in the atomic age and these exploded views, he also reconnected with Catholicism. And he starts to paint images of the Virgin Mary using Gala as a model. This caused a fair amount of controversy because she wasn't particularly known as a saint, right? She was the woman who left her marriage, she cheated on her spouse, and she abandoned her child. So to pose her as the Virgin Mary would have been kind of controversial. We can see that into the 1970s, Salvador Dali is still inspired by Gala and her form. We can see her bare backside in this painting that has this great title. This is Gala contemplating the Mediterranean Sea, which at 20 meters becomes the portrait of Abraham Lincoln. It's also, in parentheses, homage to Rothko. So we've got this great sort of view. I think this is supposed to be Christ sort of like ascending in the sky, the Mediterranean in the distance, this pixelated wall here, which our eyes can kind of resolve to a likeness of Abraham Lincoln. So we've got a little bit of art history, a little bit of history, a lot of that obsession with Gala, all baked into this. And we can see that even in the 1970s, Salvador Dali is still exploring new ways to create optical illusions in his artwork. So, I mean, surrealism is done by this time, but he is still exploring new avenues and sort of breaking boundaries that way. Here's an interesting image to leave off on this section where we can see him kind of straining to kiss her. Towards the end of their lives, Salvador Dali bought Gala her own castle. And interestingly, she said he could only go and visit her with written invitation. So that sort of suggests a little bit of a strain of their relationship towards the end there. We are going to wrap up tonight with Dali as the master of spectacle. Just a few photographs to sort of see how just the way he lived his life was performance art. So we start off here with an image of Salvador Dali. I think he's like jumping off of a roof or a terrace at his home in Spain, and he's holding a bird as though he could fly. And Salvador Dali said, "My painting is such a minor thing compared to the magic I radiate." This guy just knew how to get all the attention, right? In the 1950s, he partnered with a photographer named Philip Halsman to create a book that was sort of referred to as like a photographic interview. He'd be asked a question, and instead of having a written or verbal answer, he would answer essentially with a strange image of him and his mustache, kind of mugging, including this image here, where he's painting with that exaggerated mustache. So he was very playful, always knew how to mug for the camera, just get the flowers on the mustache and the bulging eyes, and over the top statements. Each morning when I awake, I experience again a supreme pleasure, that of being Salvador Dali. In addition, Dali, in addition to like the wild mustache, right? He knew how to get people's eyeballs on him. He had really unusual pets. This is an ocelot over here. We can see in the photograph on the right, he's walking out of the Paris metro with an anteater on a leash. Look at everybody looking at this anteater. He's just doing this matter of factly. And this is all par for the course. Like he would show up at gallery openings in a Rolls Royce filled with cauliflower. Like he just did outrageous things. And unfortunately, not all of it was documented photographically, but we can see he knew how to make a great photo. And in addition to collecting exotic animals, he collected celebrity friends. Here he is hanging out with John Lennon. Looks like he's about to kiss Andy Warhol. So he just knew that fame helped to drive the sales of his works. If he could be on a TV show, he would do it. If he could be in an advertisement on TV, he would do it. He did logos for familiar products. Like he was just a part of popular culture in so many ways. Got one last image of him here. And what a getup, right? I mean, between the hat and the necklace and this kind of scepter that he's holding, he once said, I've rarely sunk to the level going out in civilian clothes. I always go in Dali uniform, which makes you think, this is a performance. He had a sense of what he needed to do in the public. When Dali passed away in 1989, he was interred in a crypt in his own museum in Figueres, Spain. We can see that he had a hand in designing this museum because it's covered with eggs. And maybe some of you have been there before. It's still on my list of places to attend. Maybe some of you have been to the other Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. It actually has the bigger collection of Dali art. You can fly right into the Tampa airport. It's not too hard to get to. Okay. So Dali, what an outsized impact he's had on our visual landscape, on our notion of celebrity. Let's just wrap up really quickly with the persistence of Dali and what we're taking away from this hour together. How do we sum up what we've learned about him? Salvador Dali was like the P.T. Barnum of the art world, right? He was like a celebrity before we even really had celebrities. He certainly had questionable politics, right? But he was a visionary who was truly ahead of his time. He was somebody who was breaking boundaries before most of us could even imagine them. It took brilliance and I would say courage too to be the creative force that he was in a world that couldn't always understand him. Salvador Dali, I think we can all agree, was himself a work of art. Thank you. We'll end there for now. And I'll do my best to try and answer some of these questions. I'm sure I'm going to hear from a few people that have been to the museums, right? And Mary says his mustache looks like the feelers of a lobster. I think you're onto something there, Mary. Somebody else asked, who is the fashion designer who created the lobster dress? Oh, you're good to ask, and I'm positive I have that in my notes. Let me just go back to that. Elsa Schiaparelli was the designer of the lobster dress, as far as I know. I think there were a couple of different versions of it. Oh, yes. And there was the collaboration with Disney. I'm not sure if it was Fantasia. It might have been Fantasia. And somebody says, did I know that his mustache was false? I've never heard that before. I mean, it really looked like that was his mustache in that photo. Looked like it was very much pulling on his skin, but wow, if it was false. I mean, that is like his logo. If you go to the museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, there's a big giant mustache that you can take your selfie on sitting there, right? So, I'm glad somebody enjoyed this. He is quite the subject, right? And this kind of outsized ego that he presents to the world kind of reminded me of actually Frank Lloyd Wright. He would say these kind of outlandish things, but both of these guys, I think, had the genius or the vision to back it up, but they had a really good sense in terms of how to market themselves and how to get attention on their work. Nancy Parker says, it's Frida Kahlo a surrealist? Her work is definitely considered surrealist. Absolutely. You would lump her into this category, but she was in Mexico too. So she was connected, but not quite in the thick of it in the same way. So much of her work is so personal, right? But Nancy, you're good to make that connection. There's a lot of surrealistic elements to her work. I'm going to go over to the chat here. Oh, Nancy, you made me like him. I didn't want to do it. Oh, that's too funny. Betsy says it was not Fantasia. It was a short film called Destino. Thanks for that correction, that update. Um, People responding to his eyes, his sense of celebrity. Kim Kardashian, but with talent. Joyce has been to the St. Petersburg Museum. People are loving that museum. Um, Oh, the woman with the crutch in her body looks like she was wearing sneakers with no laces. Oh, that's interesting. Not Anne, Vogue editor. Anna Winter, right? Don't be dissing Anne. Let's see. I love these comments. Well, everybody, thank you so much again for being here. It's always fun to to share this work with you. It's a pleasure. It's a delight. Um, I'm really excited about next month's program too. That is on Edgar Degas, who is an artist that I've always loved, and I've just been fascinated by him because it's sort of around the holidays. I was thinking like the Nutcracker. So we're going to zoom in on his images of the ballet, which are very intriguing. And there's a lot going on there. So we're going to have, I mean, it's going to be slightly controversial and scandalous, and it'll be a lot of fun. We'll have a good time looking at those ballerinas. Oh, wow. Oh, look at this. Judith has been to his summer home and studio. I will add it to my list, Judith. Thank you. And for everybody else, yeah, I mean, at least we can go to St. Pete's, right? Um, Thank you, everybody, so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for giving me this job because I love this job. And I look forward to hearing from you. If you want to reach out, you can always reach out on my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. Find out what other programs that I'm doing that are free and open to the public. I'm going to be in Nashua, New Hampshire this Sunday, doing a Norman Rockwell program if you want to join us for that. So, otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next month when we will be doing Art on Thursdays and looking at Behind the Curtain with Edgar Degas, all those ballerinas. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.